Coronary Heart Disease in 7 Racial Groups in Singapore by C.S. Muir from the Department of Pathology, University of Malaya. Received February 16, 1959. The purpose of this communication is to examine the pattern of coronary heart disease over the years 1948 to 1957 inclusive, as seen in the mortuary of the General Hospital at Singapore in 19,415 consecutive autopsies, and to determine whether there are racial differences. The macroscopic data considered relevant were transferred from the post-mortem protocols onto a specially prepared proforma in all those cases in which the principal cause of death was given as coronary heart disease. The series does not include other cases in which coronary heart disease was an incidental finding. The island of Singapore and its population. Singapore, an island of some 217 square miles, lies 1 degree north of the equator and 104 degrees east of Greenwich. The climate is equable, the average temperature being 85 degrees Fahrenheit, and the average relative humidity 83%. There are no seasons. On the island live some 1.5 million people of varying races, religions, customs, and dietary habits. When Thomas Stamford Raffles landed on the island in 1819, the population was in the region of 150, all Bugis Malay. In 1824, when the island was formally ceded to the East India Company, it had risen to 10,000. Free immigration continued, mainly from China and India, until about 1939. Since the polyglot populace has rapidly risen until it has reached the figures shown in Table 1. Deaths from coronary heart disease. Table 1 shows, by race, the population distribution in the year 1947 and the estimated numbers in the 1957 census. The latter numbers were obtained by applying the end 1956 percentage distribution by race to the 1957 census total population figure of 1,474,000. The mean was derived and the post-mortem incidence of coronary heart disease expressed as so many per thousand per annum for each racial group. Unfortunately, neither in 1947 nor in the 1957 census was enquiry made as to religion. The latest figures available are for 1931, and these refer not to Singapore alone, but to the Straits settlements, which comprise the islands of Singapore and Penang, with the present state of Malacca. Although it is realized that these proportions can probably no longer accurate, they are applied in Table 2 since it is felt that they can, faute de mieux, be used to give a rough Indian to Indian Muslim ratio. Table 2 shows the number of deaths from coronary heart disease within the group Indians and Pakistanis, expressed as so many per thousand per annum. The Indian Muslim would appear to be twice as liable to die from coronary heart disease as his non-Muslim compatriot, and 20 times more liable than the Chinese or the Muslim Malays. Deaths in which a thrombus was found, thrombus positive group. A thrombus was discovered in the coronary arteries of 242 persons, of whom 7% were women. For the 88 Chinese in the group, the mean age of death was 51 plus or minus 11 years. For the 74 Indians, 44 plus or minus 1 year. For the 33 Indian Muslims, 46 plus or minus 10 years. For the 18 Malays, 47 plus or minus 8 years. For the 7 Eurasians, 47 plus or minus 11 years. For the 16 Europeans, 51 plus or minus 9 years. And for the 6 Sikhs, 50 plus or minus 10 years. The mean for all races was 48 plus or minus 11 years. The average age of death for Indians, Indian Muslims, and Malays is thus significantly less than for Chinese. There is no significant difference between Indians, Indian Muslims, and Malays. More Indians and Indian Muslims die from coronary inclusion on the fourth decade than do Chinese, 32 and 30% instead of 15%. Bland and White, 1951, reviewing 461 cases of clinical myocardial infarction, found that 22% were below the age of 50. In this series, the respective percentages below the age of 50 for Chinese, Indians, Indian Muslims, Malays, and Europeans are 41, 68, 60, 68, and 37, respectively. The peak incidence in the series of Bland and White in America was in the decade 50 to 59, and that of Peel in Scotland ages 59 to 59, and in that of Weiss and Gray in the American Negro. Oh, I can't say that. It was in the paper. I'm sorry. I was just reading it. And when was this published? It was published in 1959. Oh gosh, should I just stop doing this video? Okay, I just won't say it again. In the African American in the decade 60 to 69. Vakil in this series, principally Indian Hindus, found it to be in the decade 40 to 49, and the mean age at death being 49 years. In this series, the peak incidence in the Chinese is in the decade 51 to 60, in the Malay 41 to 50, and in both Indians and Indian Muslims in the decade 36 to 45. Table 3 shows by race the site of thrombosis in the thrombus-positive group. Wood, 1956, summing up the observations of several writers, notes that the anterior descending branch of the left coronary artery is affected in 66 to 75% of cases, the left circumflex in 5 to 33%, and the right in 25 to 40%. Thrombosis of the left main trunk, he states, is rare, this series 8%. The mean figures in this series lie within these values. There appears to be a racial difference in the number of thrombi found in the right coronary artery if Chinese and Indians be compared. The ratio of OD to SE is 3.5 to 1 for thrombi in the right coronary artery alone and 2.5 to 1 for thrombi in the right coronary artery both alone and in combination. The figures for Indians appears rather lower than usual, but do not differ significantly from the mean. There are no other significant differences. Macroscopic necrosis was observed in 114 of the 242 hearts in this group. Although thrombosis without infraction has been observed before, Wood giving the figure 20%, the high incidence in this series, 53%, is thought to reflect the fact that only macroscopic necrosis has been recorded. The necrosis was mainly anterior in 81 or 71%, mainly posterior in 31 or 27%, the site not being specified in a further 2 or 2%. In Indians, there was a smaller proportion of posterior infractions, 19%, reflecting the diminished frequency of thrombosis in the right coronary artery. This distribution agrees with the observations of Wortman and Hellerstein, who found chiefly anterior infractions in 72% of their cases. Morbid anatomy. In this group, the coronary ostia were involved in 6%. Subintimal hemorrhage had occurred in 4%, while the thrombus was found on an ulcerated atheromatous plaque in 12%. Gross calcification of the arterial wall was present in 21%. There was evidence of a prior infarction in 15%. The atheromatous lesions in the coronary vessels were classed as severe in 45%, as moderate in 26%, and as slight in 13%. In a further 1%, atheroma was absent, and no record had been made in the remainder. There were no significant racial differences. Myocardial fibrosis visible to the naked eye was noted in 124, or 51%. In the main, the thrombus formed in the artery that supplied the fibrotic area of the heart. The Indian Muslim, however, deviated significantly from this rule, a phenomenon for which no explanation can be offered. Rupture of the heart was seen in 7% of cases, a cardiac aneurysm in 2%, thromboembolic phenomena in 2%, and mural thrombosis in 6%. In the Indian Muslim, the incidence of these complications was much higher than in other races, respective figures being 18, 12, 6, and 30%, differences that are statistically significant. The mean incidence of these complications is much less than in most reported series. Wood regards the upper limit of cardiac rupture as being 15%. Hellerstein and Martin, adding up the findings of 11 workers, record thromboembolic phenomena in 11.5% and intramural thrombi in 40%. Figures for cardiac aneurysm vary enormously depending on what the author regards as an aneurysm. Clayland gives 4% in his Australian series. Deaths in which no thrombus was found. Thrombus negative group. No thrombus was found in the coronary arteries of 316 persons, for whom 25 or 8% were women. In 150 Chinese, the mean age at death was 51 plus or minus 12 years. In 86 Indians, 46 plus or minus 11 years. In 41 Indian Muslims, 44 plus or minus 7 years. In 17 Malays, 46 plus or minus 10 years. In 5 Eurasians, 49 plus or minus 8 years. In 13 Europeans, 57 plus or minus 13 years. And in 4 Sikhs, 59 plus or minus 8 years. The mean for all races was 48 plus or minus 11 years. The average age at death in the thrombus negative group for Indians and Indian Muslims is significantly lower than in Chinese, the OD-SE ratio being respectively 2 and 4 to 1. There is no statistically significant difference between Malays, Indians, and Indian Muslims. By the age of 50, 49% of the Chinese, 69% of the Indians, 60% of the Indian Muslims, and 49% of the Malays in this group had died. The peak incidence was in the decade 46 to 55, with the exception of the Indian where it was in the decade 41 to 50. Comparison with the thrombus positive group reveals a remarkable similarity. Fakil noted a similar picture when he compared his coronary occlusion and angina pectoris groups. Morbid anatomy. Myocardial necrosis was found in 141 of the hearts of this group, 44%. Rupture of the myocardium was noted in 4%, a cardiac aneurysm in 2%, mural thrombosis in 3%, and thromboembolic phenomena in 1%. There were no significant racial differences. Atheroma in the coronary vessels was found to be severe in 69%, moderate in 19%, slight in 7%, and absent in 2%. Although the cause of death was given as coronary heart disease, no note had been made about the state of the coronary vessel wall in the remainder. The arteries were occluded by atheroma in 83, or 26% of cases, but the Indian Muslim, they were occluded in 37%. Macroscopic fibrosis of the myocardium was found in 59% of the thrombus negative group, being predominantly anterior in 67% and predominantly posterior in 19%. In the remaining 13% of the site, the fibrosis was not stated. The higher incidence of fibrosis in the thrombus negative group is a reflection, one presumes, of the large number showing severe atheroma. Association with cardiac enlargement. Although the normal heart weight for most of the population of Singapore is probably about 350 grams, only the hearts weighing 450 grams or more are classed as enlarged for the purpose of this paper. 139 enlarged hearts, or 25%, were found on this criterion. There were no racial differences, nor were more thrombi found in this group. Bartels and Smith noted hypertrophy in 88% of Cleland in 60% of infracted hearts examined post-mortem. It has been held that the enlargement seen in infracted hearts has been due to a coexistent hypertension. Master examined 500 men clinically who suffered from coronary occlusion and concluded that, allowing for the natural increase of blood pressure with aging, the enlargement was due to coronary insufficiency rather than hypertension. He also showed that hypertension does not predispose to the formation of a cardiac aneurysm. But Friedberg and Soval examined the hearts post-mortem of 100 cases of acute coronary occlusion and found that there was no increase in heart size except in those with an ante-mortem record of hypertension. It is regretted that in this series no ante-mortem data are available for most of the patients, hence no opinion can be given to this question. Coronary heart disease in women. Estimates as to the incidence of coronary heart disease in women vary considerably. Weiss and Gray found that the male-female ratio for their series of African Americans to be 1:1. Clausen found it to be 4:1, Vakil to 8:1, and Jayawardene and Jayasekere 10:1. In this series, 41% were women, a male-female ratio of 12:1. However, only 34% of the necrosis in this series of 19,415 were performed on female subjects. There were 16 women in the thrombus positive group, 12 of whom were Chinese. The mean age at death for the Chinese was 49 plus or minus 11 years, and for the 16, 50 plus or minus 10 years. In the thrombus negative group, there were 25 women, including 19 Chinese and 5 Indians. The mean age at death for the Chinese was 55 plus or minus 15 years, for the Indians 59 plus or minus 13 years, and for the whole group 57 plus or minus 14 years. Most authors seem to agree that, whereas men show a peak incidence of coronary heart disease, the incidence in women gradually rises from the 50s onward, until in 70s it is equal to or surpasses that of men. In this series, 58% of the Chinese women with thrombi had died before the age of 50, men 38%, the peak incidence being in the decade 41 to 50, men 51 to 60. In the thrombus negative group, 47% had died before the age of 50, men 59%, the peak incident being in the decade 41 to 50, men 46 to 55. Vakil found the peak incidence for women to be in the decades 40 to 60, and 46% of his 26 women had died before attaining 50 years. From the evidence available, it seems likely that the age distribution of coronary heart disease in the East is somewhat different to that reported in the West. In the thrombus-positive group, the ages ranged from 26 to 66 years. The youngest case is of some interest, being 5 months pregnant at the time of death. Autopsy revealed a large recent thrombus in the right main coronary artery 4 centimeters from its commencement, coronary vessels that appeared normal, and no abnormality of the genital tract. In 5 or 31% of the thrombus-positive cases, the thrombus was noted to be old. In the thrombus-negative group, the youngest case, aged 27, showed severe atheroma of both coronary arteries, anterior fibrosis, and necrosis of the myocardium, with a recent rupture 2 centimeters long at the apex. Association with effort. Only 11 of the 242 deaths in the thrombus-positive group were noted as being associated with physical effort. Of these, 4 occurred in Indian Muslims. 7 deaths occurred in the lavatory. Phipps noted exertion in 13% of his cases. Master noted severe effort in 2% and moderate effort in 9%. These low figures do not accord with the experience of all. Surprisingly, an even smaller number in the thrombus-negative group died during or shortly after physical exertion. Of these, 5 were Malays. 8 deaths occurred in the lavatory. At the outset of this investigation, it was felt that it would be better to consider only those cases that came within the jurisdiction of H.M. Coroner, it being argued that violent and sudden deaths were likely to affect all races in much the same proportions. This did not prove to be so, and this group was found to be heavily weighted by Indians and Indian Muslims. Part, but not all, of this bias was due to the large numbers of deaths from coronary heart disease within these 2 racial groups. Consideration of those dying in hospitals revealed many points of bias. For religious reasons, virtually no postmortems are obtained in Malays or Indian Muslims, hence this series is unduly weighted by Chinese. It is much easier to obtain permission to examine a child than an adult. A necropsy may be performed on a body not claimed within 24 hours of death. Consequently, many children, but few adults, come to morbid examination under this ruling. It was felt, therefore, that rather than attempt to disentangle these many factors, with probably results of dubious value, it would be better to relate all figures obtained to the total number of postmortems performed in this period, 1948 to 1957 inclusive. Despite this, postmortem figures probably reflect the relative racial proportions quite well. During the 9 years 1948 to 1956, 1,178 deaths were registered by the Registrar General as being due to arteriosclerotic heart disease, including coronary disease. This is equivalent to 1% of the 103,464 deaths in that period, or to the 0 deaths per 1,000 population per annum. This latter figure is 2 times the mean autopsy rate for coronary heart disease. Unfortunately, there is no racial breakdown for these figures, but should it be assumed that the 626 persons who were not autopsied were all of Chinese race, the ratio of Indians plus Pakistanis to Chinese for deaths from coronary heart disease would be 0.265, 0.093, or 2.85, a figure that is still highly significant. Rise in incidence. Many reports have come from the Occident purporting to show a steady rise in the incidence of coronary heart disease over the past 30 years. Ryle and Russell in the United Kingdom, Davidson in Australia, Denny and Headley in the United States of America. In Singapore, pre-war autopsy figures are not available as all records were destroyed during the Japanese occupation. The records of the Registrar General in Singapore were, however, maintained during this period. Figure 1 shows the rise in the number of deaths from coronary heart disease as recorded by the Registrar General of Singapore, per 1,000 population, related to the numbers dying from all the other forms of heart disease per 1,000 population during the decades 1938 to 1947 and 1948 to 1957. The mean incidence is 0.16% of all deaths in the former decade and 1.03% in the latter, but the incidence of deaths from other forms of heart disease is much lower. The percentage incidence is also falsely low in the decade 1937 to 1947 due to the increased incidence of and death rate from tuberculosis, beriberi, and malaria. There is nevertheless a large increase over the 20 years. Post-mortem figures since the war show that coronary heart disease accounted for 2.9% of all deaths, or 21.2% of all cardiac deaths. The diminution in incidence during the war years will be readily observed. In this period of privatization, coronary heart disease was held to be much less common, and this was also the experience in other countries, such as Norway. This decrease was attributed to diminished intake of foods rich in cholesterol. Schnoringel noted a fall in the incidence of coronary sclerosis in Rotterdam, the lowest figures, as in Singapore, being found in 1944 and 1945. From the neighboring territory of Malaya, Marsden remarks that coronary disease occurs and is well known. In Malaya, over the years 1948 to 1956, the total hospital inpatient population was 2,056,270. During this period, 940 cases of coronary heart disease were treated, an incidence of 0.46 per 1,000. Of these, 39% died. General statistics for the whole country are unreliable as many deaths are not certified by medical practitioners. In both territories, there have been a steady increase in the numbers with this disease treated in hospital. In 1948, in Singapore, there were 6, and in the Federation, 2 patients per 10,000 hospital admissions. By 1956, the corresponding figures were 30 and 10, respectively, a considerable rise. Discussion. Coronary heart disease is still stated to be rare among the Chinese. Snapper has emphasized the rarity of coronary arteriosclerosis in North China, believing this to be due to a low intake of fats containing saturated fatty acids. Tung reported 18 cases of coronary thrombosis, remarked that up to that time no paper on coronary disease in China has been published. 15 of his patients came from the upper social and economic strata of Shanghai and might be well expected to have a much higher intake of richer foods. Foster noted the rarity of arteriosclerosis in patients attending the Yale Hunan Hospital and found only 1 case of angina pectoris in 4,000. He noted the low blood pressure of the local population and found that the blood pressure of Americans living there gradually fell too. Houston has noticed that the blood pressure of immigrant Chinese in America rises. Vakil has described coronary heart disease in Bombay. 1,860 of the admissions to the King Edward Memorial Hospital suffered from some form of organic heart disease, and of these, 250 had some form of coronary heart disease, 13.5% of all cardiac cases. The highest incidence was observed at least a decade earlier than in reported Western statistics. The same has been the experience of numerous colleagues in this country. He studied the question of racial incidence and concluded that the incidence of coronary disease is higher in the minority communities, such as Indian Muslims, Indian Christians, Parsis, and Jews. He does not relate his figures to the population at large. Wijayaskara, studying clinically 100 cases of myocardial infarction in Ceylon, found that contrary to most other countries, the incidence was highest in the low-income groups, but his series did not include nursing home cases, which may account for the difference. He found that the incidence highest among Eurasians and Burghers, immediate in the Tamils, at least in the Sinhalese, and respective figures being 0.26, 0.12, and 0.06 per 1,000 of the population. The peak incidence was in the decade 50 to 60, 38% dying below the age of 50. These figures are almost identical with those of Jayawardi and Jayasekari, who find the post-mortem incidence of Colombo to be 368 in 3,632 consecutive autopsies, both hospital and judicial, or 10%. There is no body of evidence to suggest that the Chinese in China are not prone to coronary heart disease. In Singapore, it has been shown that the Chinese element of the population, while not by any means immune, is very much less liable to coronary heart disease than the Indian, Indian Muslim, Eurasian, and European communities. Vakil has shown that the Indian Muslim is probably more liable to coronary disease than the Hindu. This is borne out in Singapore. Ruffer, who had performed 800 autopsies on Muslim pilgrims on the road to Mecca, found coronary atheroma to be as common as in Europeans. Yet from our figures in Singapore, the Muslim Malay dies, but rarely from coronary heart disease. It would be in this context be interesting to examine the incidence of coronary and other heart disease in a Muslim Chinese community, such as exists in West China, and relate it to non-Muslim Chinese nearby. Such a survey would show whether the Muslim way of life has a role in the causation of coronary heart disease. There may be some factors that makes coronary atheroma more dangerous to one racial group than another, for as Davies remarks, in Africa one of the puzzling features of atheroma in Africans is the rarity of coronary thrombosis. Similarly, Becker finds that the incidence of atheromatosis in Bantu and black subjects is low, for in his series of 3,000 consecutive postmortems, atheromatosis was responsible for the death of only 11 subjects, and only one of these was due to coronary thrombosis. The African American has long been held to be less liable to a coronary heart disease than the white American, but Holubeck, Yater, and others have shown that this is probably not so. Whether this apparent increase is true or represents a higher standard of living and medical care, no one seems to know. Mueller found the post-mortem incidence of atherosclerosis in Java, where there is also a multiracial population, to be the same as in Holland, noting that prior to this date no cases of either coronary thrombosis or coronary sclerosis had been encountered in the post-mortem material of Batavia and Surabaya. Zuidema, writing in 1952, describes 79 cases of clinical coronary thrombosis occurring in Europeans, Chinese, and Indonesians in Jakarta, most of whom came from the higher income groups. It is tempting to ascribe the differences found to dietary habit. In Singapore, the diet of most Chinese is based on rice. Much of the food is greasy, being cooked in vegetable oil, less commonly in pig lard. Fish is probably the staple source of protein, pork being reserved for festivals and egg and milk consumption being very low. The diet of the non-Muslim Indian from the north and of the Sikh is based on chapatis, made from atta flour. He drinks a large amount of milk, eats little meat, and his cooking is done in ghee. The southern non-Muslim Indian subsists on rice, cooked vegetables, and a very hot curry, usually a fish each day. Mutton is usually eaten once a week, and the cooking is done in linseed or coconut oil. The Indian Muslim likes very oily food, which is nearly all cooked in ghee. He consumes more mutton than anybody else, usually the fattier cuts, eating meat about 3 days a week, and he also favors a sedentary occupation. The Malay lives on fish and rice, usually curried, rarely eating meat. His cooking is done in coconut oil. It will be appreciated that the diets outlined are subject to considerable variation, especially in the more wealthy families. The more exact composition of these diets, with particular reference to the degree of saturation of the fats, will be the subject of a further communication. The impression gained is that although the Indian Muslim is a greater fat eater, other Indians, particularly the Tamils from the south, do not eat much more, if as much, fat as the Chinese or Malay, who have a much lower incidence of coronary heart disease. Summary and conclusions. The morbid anatomy of coronary heart disease, as it occurred in 552 persons of various races in Singapore, is described. In general, it is found to be the same once developed for each race and to be the same as elsewhere in the world. Minor racial differences are noted, such as low incidence of right coronary artery thrombosis in the Indian compared with the Chinese, and the generally more fulminating nature of the disease in the Indian Muslim. The majority of those dying from coronary heart disease do so before attaining the age of 50 years. In the Occident, the reverse obtains. Major racial differences are shown to exist in the incidence of coronary heart disease, the Indian Muslim being 20 times and the Indian 10 times more liable to die from this disease than the Chinese or Malay. The sex incidence of coronary heart disease in Chinese women in Singapore is found to be the same as in the West, but the age incidence appears different. Evidence is being presented to suggest the incidence of coronary heart disease in Singapore and in neighboring Malaya is increasing. A fall in mortality from coronary heart disease during the war years with a concomitant rise in the deficiency of diseases suggests that diet, as well as race, plays a part in pathogenesis. Certain features of coronary heart disease in India, China, Ceylon, and Africa are discussed. Whew, okay, made it through that one. I should start reading over these before I just jump into a video where I'm reading it out loud, especially when it's a paper from fucking, what is this from? 1959. Yeah, I probably should have seen some of those bullets coming. Alright, hope the rest of y'all have a very nice night.